I want to say congratulations. We look forward to working with you to strengthen the campaign finance program. While last week marks the end of election season, the work of the CFB is entering a new phase. Our staff will be working with the candidates and their treasurers to conduct thorough post-election audits to ensure the public funds that the board provided were spent properly. In addition to our auditing process, the CFB will prepare a post-election report in the next several months. This report will assess the impacts of New York City's campaign finance program in the 2017 elections and recommend improvements to the program for consideration by the New York City Council. We have much ahead as it comes to our voter assistance initiatives as well. So at this time, I will turn to the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee Chair, Naomi Zouderer, for her report.
Thank you, Chair Schaefer. We have several important announcements to make regarding our voter assistance efforts, both in the lead up to and following the general election held last week. Starting the week before the election, CFB staff led one of the largest phone banking efforts out to get out the vote since we started doing this work. Volunteers placed over 9,000 phone calls to New York City voters and spoke with over 1,000 people who committed to voting. I want to applaud all of the New Yorkers who volunteered, either individually or with their school, sorority, or civic group, to help get their fellow voters to the polls. In particular, I want to commend the following organizations for participating in our phone banking: the Urban Assembly School of Math and Science, the Harlem Children's Zone, StreetSquash.org, and the Alpha Kappa Alpha and Zeta Phi Beta sororities. This was an outstanding accomplishment and a job well done. In the coming weeks, we will be asking New Yorkers to talk about their voting experience in the 2017 elections. CFB staff will be reaching out to some of the voters we were in touch with before the election to see if they did in fact make it to the polls. And the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee will hold a public hearing on December 13th. New Yorkers will have the chance to voice their opinions about our electoral system in a public forum. We'll make more information about this event available in the days ahead. With that, I will turn to CFB Executive Director Amy Loprest for her report.
I just have a brief report. I want to say that over the past weekend, we held the 9th Youth Poet Laureate contest, and I am pleased to announce that William Loher, who is a sophomore at Stuyvesant High School, will be the 9th Youth Poet Laureate. For those who don't know, the Youth Poet Laureates work with our youth voter coordinator to present to youths programs about voting and the importance of voting and perform their poetry, their voting poetry all over the city. And in past years, the Youth Poet Laureate has spoken at the inauguration, at Poet in the Pocket Day for Poetry Month in April, and all over the city. So we're looking forward to a productive year with, and congratulations to Mr. Loher.
Very interesting. All right. We have several matters relating to proposed penalties from the 2013 election cycle. Our schedule indicates 2 appearances. Is there an appearance from the campaign of Manuel Lantigua today? No, it doesn't appear to be. All right, then let's move on to the Lexington Democrats. This pertains to a matter from the 2017 election cycle. Is there a representative from Lexington Democrats here today?
Yes, there is.
So please take a seat at the table. CFB staff will make a short presentation, and you will go next. I'm going to ask you both to address something that you may not have anticipated addressing, but the board would like you to. Both. And that is that the staff's recommendation includes a penalty for the failure to report expenditures and a violation but no penalty for the failure to report contributions. I'd like counsel for the CFB to address the question of why you made the recommendation of no penalty, and for you to also address the question of why you think, in this case, the CFB staff was correct in making that recommendation. Okay, so you may not have anticipated as that being even a subject of discussion, but the board would like to hear a discussion on that. So why don't you start?
Sure. Good morning, Chair Schaefer, Executive Director Loprest, members of the board, Mr. Marks. My name is Bethany Persky, Deputy General Counsel for the CFB. Before the board is the matter of Lexington Democrats, an independent spender in the 2017 elections. CFB staff is recommending that the board find that the spender committed the following violations: failure to report expenditures and failure to report contributions. The spender contests the recommended penalty amounts.
Good morning, board. Thank you for being here today. And Ms. Persky, thank you very much for being here as well. To address,
could you enter your appearance?
My name is Darren Marks. I'm here. I'm attorney on behalf of LexDems 2017. To address specifically the question that was just presented as to why there should not be a penalty for the failure to disclose, I think when you look at the intent and the purpose of the CFB as with regards to independent expenditures, it's about reporting. It's about opening up to people where is money coming from, who are the people who are participating in our electoral process, in the democratic process, by making their voices heard for one candidate or another, or for one issue or another. Specifically to the issue as to why there should be no penalty for the failure to report, just from a bird's eye view on this, there was reporting. It was just done late. It was an error that was corrected by the committee itself without the CFB having to say, "Hey, you did something wrong." It was an honest error by someone who had never been a treasurer before. But specifically to your question now with regards to why there should be no penalty for the failure for the disclosure, I think it's because it's readily obvious as to who it was. The names aren't confusing. There was no intent to mislead. It was just so when you look at the reports, it's there. There's no, essentially, there's no harm, no foul, because it's in the public record. People can see who was the contribution.
It's not in the public record till after the election, till 2 or 3 weeks after the election. And one of the purposes of the independent expenditure rules is that people know everything before the election.
I think fair enough, and to the point that there was a 2 mailings done by this committee. When you look at the mailing that was done, it was stated on the mailing who it was from. So there was never, even if there was never a reporting done, anyone who received the mailings that were done by this committee would have known right away who they were from.
But would they necessarily have known who paid for it? They may have known top donor, but why would an average citizen know that the money didn't come from some other third party?
Because there was only one donor, and it's.
Well, you know that, but how does a citizen know that before election day?
It was stated on the material.
Oh, it said top donor. Didn't list all the donors.
In this situation where there's only one donor, there's no one else. And your point,
but you don't know.
No, and your point is well taken. Hypothetically, had there been more donors, there would have been an issue. But again, that point specifically here is academic and not. It's addressed by the fact that the sole entity who paid for it was already disclosed.
Let me come back to my question. Sorry to interrupt the flow of your argument a little bit. The question I had, and I'm going to ask you to respond to it, doesn't go to the question of the amount of the penalty overall. I know you want to continue to address that issue, and you will have the opportunity. My question went to the fact that there are 2 violations here for which the staff recommended a penalty on the first, the failure to report expenditures, and no penalty on the second. And I'd like you just to briefly explain your thinking in making that recommendation. And then just on that narrow point, if you have anything to add, fine. If you're prepared to rest on Ms. Persky's argument, that you don't have to address it at all.
Sure. So the staff's view was that the connection between the spender and the original source of the funds, the contributor, is clear on its face based on the names of the organizations, and that this was not an attempt to conceal some material information about the source of the funds from the public. The primary reason for the contribution disclosure requirements is to ensure that there's not one reported spender that's a political club, but the funds are really coming from something like a real estate interest or a union or someone with their own agenda and their interests that the voters would have a right to know about. These are two very clearly affiliated organizations. They presumably have the same interests. And so our view was that there was no material information that was withheld, and certainly there was no indication that there was an intent to conceal.
Back to you, and you need not continue to address that specific point, but feel free to make your larger point about the amount of the penalty.
Well, considering are we talking specific about the first penalty that was a zero penalty?
No, if you now wish to address the violation for which there is a penalty, okay, feel free to do so.
So to the first point about where there is no penalty, I think that's been addressed. If there's any further questions, I'll be happy to take those as well. With respect to the second violation, where there is a penalty being assessed of $4,128, I just would like to go through a very quick time frame as to what happened here. The Lex Dems 2017 was created in around August with a funding of about $16,512.08. Two mailings were done, one on September 1st, one on September 7th. As I mentioned before, the treasurer for that committee is someone who's new to being a treasurer, new to the campaign finance board, and made a mistake in not doing the filings. There was no intent to deceive. There was no malice. It was an error. Upon their own realizing of the error, corrected it upon their realizing the mistake, immediately filed, which triggered the CFB issuing the notice. The initial notice was for about $8,256.08.
But the club was aware of this requirement from 2013, as we understand it, right?
Well, the club, yes and no. No, because Lex Dems 2013 was a separate entity had separate people. There were no connections of the people involved in Lex Dems 2013 and Lex Dems 2017. To the extent that the CFB put in their letter that a letter was even sent to my address, I never received that address. I live at that point I was living in a 36-story building. The mailing was sent to the building address without an apartment number. I never received that mailing, and I don't recall the treasurer from 2013 saying that there was an issue. And again, given the fact that having seen the letter for the first time in the attachments here, they were let off with a warning. So I guess that treasurer, Mr. Brian Carney, was not involved in Lex Dems 2017. I was not involved in Lex Dems 2017. I'm volunteering as a lawyer for that committee. That's about the extent of the relationship. I had no involvement in Lex Dems 2017. I never spoke to the to the principal of it. I never spoke to the treasurer about it. Except, actually, I never spoke to them until after this happened, and then at that point there was a conversation.
Let me ask you a question: Who decides to create Lex Dems 2013 or 2017?
The Lexington Democratic Club's executive committee decided.
Okay, so they decide that. So they know the experience from 2013?
Again, given the fact that I was the principal for the Lex Dems 2013. I didn't know about that warning letter because again, it was sent to my building address, but not an apartment number, and the letter it clearly shows that it's a 30. I mean, that's sent to 375 South End Avenue without an apartment number. I never saw that letter, so I would have no knowledge of it.
But who else received that notice?
Brian Carney.
And what was his position?
He was the treasurer of Lex Dems 2013.
And was he also a member of the executive committee of the Lexington Democratic Club?
He was. I don't believe he was at the board meetings this year. The Lexington Democratic Club is a volunteer organization, so we have board members who are involved, but don't necessarily come to board meetings. They do their own thing. But again, there was no. Again, looking back from 2013, and again, they're two separate entities.
No, I understand, but I mean, I think we have to treat the Lexington Democratic Club as an ongoing entity, and the fact that somebody doesn't attend a meeting or doesn't communicate to the other members of an executive committee, it seems to me the entity is deemed to be on notice.
Well,
especially because of the second argument that you make.
but what?
This in the violation number 2, where there's there's a recommendation of a violation of penalty.
Right.
Your argument has been that Lex Dems and the Lexington Democratic Club are essentially one and the same. And so, if that's the case, and then shouldn't Lexington Democratic Club have actually been responsible for knowing and passing that knowledge along for this?
Again, I think given the fact that the 2013 violation in 2 parts, one, that I personally had never seen this letter before receiving Ms. Persky's documents 2 days ago. I had not seen that letter before, so I don't know how I can personally convey information that I don't know.
But you're personally not being. You're representing an entity.
No, but I can't speak for Mr. Carney as to whether or not he saw it, or whether or not, again, given the fact that there was no penalty, and I knew the knowledge from 2013 was that we did an independent expenditure, and that we did our reportings, and that it was closed without issue. That was my takeaway from 2013. I had no knowledge of that letter. So
whoa. No knowledge of the letter, but was there knowledge of the fact that, forget about the letter, was there knowledge of the fact that there were violations that were closed without action?
No, I did not know.
You just said. I just thought.
No, I said I didn't know. I did. No, I said I've never seen.
I want to distinguish between the letter and whether
I said my knowledge from 2013 was that the committee had done an independent expenditure, that it had done its reporting, and that it was closed without issue. I did not know about. I did not know. That's what I said. It was closed without issue. I did not know of anything else to have any other knowledge.
But can I ask you a question? But the broader issue is whether you knew that you had to do disclosure. It's not really that letter that said that you had no action. It's not really necessarily important. Really, the main issue is whether the club knew that they had to do disclosure, and I assume that they did because they filed the disclosure statement.
Absolutely. Again, I think we have to focus specifically. We're here for today is the fact that the Lex Dems 2017 treasurer made a mistake. We concede that the mistake was made. There's never been a point that we've argued that there wasn't a mistake. We recognize there was a mistake that was made, but it was a mistake that was self-corrected, that was corrected by ourselves, but by Lex Dems 2017. It wasn't a mistake that CFB had to come tracking Lex Dems 2017 down and say, hey, you didn't do your responsibilities. Yes, it was done. It was done late. But I think our issue is looking at the size of the fine in comparison to what would be the penalty had a candidate done this, which is about, I think the fine would have been about $100. There's no the issues that we have are the fact that this fine is 42 times, as it's proposed now, is 42 times higher than the penalty that would be assessed against another committee had they done the same type of mistake. That's where our issue is, and also the penalty guidelines, which I was told exist, aren't published. We don't know what they are. It's not something that even if we're the most diligent filer and someone who says I'm going to start an independent expenditure committee, I'm going to go file a CFB, do everything they say, but I want to know every single rule. What's my upside? What's my downside? Would never have known the penalties.
I think the lack of publication is kind of a non-issue here. The law requires filing, and presumably you would not have calculated in an intentional way not to file because you thought the penalty was lower than it turned out to be. So I don't think there's any detrimental reliance here. The staff's guidelines, and they're only the staff's guidelines, they're not really even the board's guidelines, and in any event, the board is completely free de novo to make an assessment as the penalty. I don't think there's any reliance argument here. Yes, they were not published. In the future, I think if we're going to have guidelines, we ought to publish them. No argument there. But there's no real detrimental reliance here. I think the stronger argument, although for me at least not yet convincing, is that there is a large discrepancy. But I think the guidelines for individual candidates are not applicable. That's perfectly clear on their face. And the policy concerns about independent expenditures, I think, are different, and I think to our thinking greater than for individual candidates, because of the potential for independent expenditures to kind of overwhelm the entire program. So I think, put aside the guidelines for a minute as a non-issue, accept the fact that we're particularly concerned about independent expenditures, and knowing that's our tendency at the moment, address the amount if you think it's too high.
May I ask you to interject with one follow-on?
Sure.
To that? Sure. I think so. Put yourself in the shoes of a citizen, and we're trying to report these independent expenditures. But let's say that the expenditure came from the Koch brothers or the Soros, and there was an expenditure made, but the disclosure came after the election. Would you feel differently about this?
I think, again, you have to go back to what Mr. Schaefer just said about the totality of the circumstances. Again, I think that Mr.
But let's say there's an innocent mistake, that the first-time reporter on this that all those other circumstances are the same.
Mr. Chang, I would respectfully say that the hypothetical you propose is very different from the situation that's before here. Here, this is the Lex Dems 2017 is not the Koch brothers. It's not the Soros family. This is a community organization that is funded by community people who are getting involved in a single community race within their district. This isn't outside money coming in. This is inside money communicating within their own community. So I think there's a very big difference there as to who the participants are. To Mr. Schaefer's point about, again, what the purpose of the CFB serves a very important function, which is to make sure that there is disclosure, that people, are aware as to who is participating in our democratic process. And to that point, I would point even to the guidelines of the board as set forth in the charter, where they talk about penalties for being levied for when there's intentional or knowing violations. Here, if you want to deem that the late filing was intentional because they knew or should have known, that's fine. But it wasn't. Again, there wasn't an intent to deceive. There wasn't an intent to violate the law. It was a mistake. So when you weigh in on the totality of the circumstances, and again, the focus of the charter, and if you even look at 15E, where it mentions that the whole purpose of the charter is that information regarding independent expenditures be promptly made accessible to the public during the covered election cycle. Here, when we look at the totality of the circumstances of everything that's involved, it's not big outside money coming in. It's local money being spent to talk to their neighbors. And the mailings that were done had on them that who published it. So even if there was no filing, in some argument, there would be a substantial compliance with the CFB's focus of making sure that people knew who was spending money to be involved in the local races.
Well, it's not just the recipients that need that information. It's all members of the public that need to understand those contributions, those expenditures prior to the election day.
Agreed. And again, that's why they're not contesting the mistake of the untimely filing. I think simply our argument is that when you look at the totality of the circumstance, what you're dealing just here, I don't want to talk about the Koch brothers, I don't want to talk about the Soros, I don't want to talk about all these various things. When we talk about just the totality of these circumstances, where we're looking at a community group doesn't have a lot of money, they're not rich like the Koch brothers or the Soros. This is small. These are small community people doing what the CFB wants, which is civic involvement, being involved. When they did their own, I would present to the board, had every independent expenditure been done in the way that it was done here, there wouldn't be a need for a lot of the rules, because the filing, the on its face, the two mailings that were done clearly stated who sent them. Even if there was never a filing, the public at large, whoever would look at that document and say, "Oh, I got this piece of mail from Lex Dems 2017. Oh, it's a Lexington Democratic Club." It was all stated on those mailings. So there was a substantial compliance on the face of the actual independent expenditure. The fact that the treasurer made a rookie error and didn't file his paper is wrong. And the fact is, you're 100% right in the need for full disclosure, because not every independent expenditure is done with this level of integrity. And again, so if it wasn't, if those circumstances were presented here, I would present to the board a different argument. But here, when we look at the totality of everything that was done, a fine that's 42 times larger than what a different committee, than what a campaign would do. And I respecting Mr. Schaefer's position that independent expenditures and candidates are treated differently because of the various levels of scrutiny that are given to candidates. $4,200 for a 25% is just, it seems high and almost, just arbitrary, capricious, especially since there's no clear guidelines. And again, as Mr. Schaefer, to address Mr. Schaefer's point, there's not an issue here of reliance. Well, we know that we can do this because this is the law and this is the upside downside. That's not my argument. My argument is that when you look at the city charter, of what the city charter requires of of its agencies, that to be published in accordance with CAPA, that people have the ability to know what the rules are, and which is done very well for candidates, seems to be missing for independent expenditures, and it doesn't seem to be a compelling argument as to why one set of participants in the CFB are treated one way, candidates who are given a clear list of what the rules are, and independent expenditors who are not given a clear list.
Well, they know that the penalty could be $10,000, and I think we take that very seriously. And let me just say one thing. I mean, I don't think we accept the innocent mistake argument. I don't accept the innocent mistake argument in the sense that, put aside your letter, the letter in 2013 went to the treasurer, and it seems to me that given the connection between the two, the club and these two entities that they create for these purposes, either they knew about the requirement or they were reckless in not knowing. If you're going to do independent expenditures, you better know what the rules are, and they were put on notice in 2013. So on that point, I don't accept, at least speaking personally, I don't accept sort of the innocent mistake argument.
Again, Mr. Davis, I respecting your position, look, this is, like I mentioned before, the Lexington Democratic Club is a volunteer organization, and it's not people who it doesn't have a full-time staff. It doesn't have an office. It is basically people who of like mind who are trying to get involved in the community, and at their various points, specifically to the point of Mr. Carney and his involvement then versus his involvement now. Mr. Carney is a partner at a law firm who since then has had 2 additional kids. His involvement in the Lexington Democratic Club is far diminished, despite the fact that he has a role in a board member seat on the board still. He's not someone who's active. And again,
is your position that nobody else knew about what happened in 2013, that nobody else at the Lexington Democratic Club board knew what happened in 2013?
No one did, because again, the whole purpose of doing an independent expenditure was that once it was voted, it was kept separate.
Your position is Mr. Carney never went back, never discussed, that there was never any communication back and forth? I haven't seen any evidence put forth that would establish that.
Well, I don't think we have the burden of proving the evidence that happened. I think the burden of proof is the other way.
I think the fact that the communication went to a member of the executive committee of the Lexington is sufficient to meet our obligation. So anyway,
but again, to that point also, to the extent that one of those letters came to me, I've come here and given truthful testimony to the fact that
I accept you didn't
that it was mailed to my address, which is a 36-story building with hundreds of units, and it didn't have my unit number, and I never saw that letter.
We're prepared to accept it.
Okay.
So I just to refer you to that letter, and I have no reason not to believe you never received it, but the letter is essentially a memorialization of a prior communication. What it says is, Lex Dems 2013 failed to report the entire cost of 4 reported expenditures. Once informed of this error, Lex Dems 2013 made the necessary corrections in an amendment. So somebody at the organization was informed of this issue and took corrective action.
And again, as I mentioned before, having been someone who was part of that Lex Dems 2013, it was two people, it was Mr. Carney and myself. I did not have any knowledge. And again, we're not here for Lex Dems 2013, we're for Lex Dems 2017. And it wasn't, once the Independent Expenditure Committee was created, it was on its own, away from the Democratic Club itself. So to that point where to make sure that there's no appearance of any sort of other commingling or collusion or whatever the term they want to use, it's a separate entity. It's on its own. So to the fact that Lex Dems 2017, I believe, also only had two people related to that independent expenditure, the rest of the Democratic Club wouldn't necessarily know what's going on with it. So I hope that addresses your point.
It does.
Can I just ask Ms. Percy a quick question? If the staff recommended a VNP on the second violation,
Yes.
Untimely disclosure violation, had the staff taken a different direction and recommended a higher penalty, what might that penalty have been?
That would have been the equivalent of the expenditure penalty. So it would essentially be double the total penalty that it is now.
So more than $8,000
yes.
in total.
And the penalty amount is, of course, by definition proportional to the amount spent because it's calculated as a percentage.
And I actually want to just point out one thing. If you'd done a good enough job, and thank you for all that testimony, but if you'd done a good enough job on targeting your mailing, then neither your opponents nor the public at large would have any idea about the contributions or expenditures. So in other words, the disclosure legend on those flyers would be meaningless. Let's say you targeted just people who supported your candidate just to get out the vote, and it was very well targeted and narrowly targeted. Now the public has no notice or ability to find that information. Do you see what I'm saying?
I don't necessarily agree with it, because if that were the case, there'd be no purpose in doing an independent expenditure like the one that was done. The whole purpose that you put it in the public, and in this modern era of social media and smartphones and selfies, very few things happen anymore that aren't thrust into the public, and people take pictures of things, posted on Facebook, on Instagram, I'm not too great. I think it's my limited knowledge of social media. So, so I don't know what other social media sites might be used. But again, I think once something is published and once it is disseminated to whatever the size or the scope of the audience, it's out there. And if it's the whole purpose of doing an expenditure is to put it out into the public, is so that it could be seen. So it doesn't matter if it's mailed to one person or 1 million people. Once it's out there for everyone to see if they can get to it, or if it's put online.
Mr. Marks, let me ask you a question. So you think this penalty is too high, recognizing that we view independent expenditures different than candidate expenditures?
Yes.
Situation. What do you think would be an appropriate penalty? Do you have a specific recommendation?
Actually, I do. I think, given, again, it's a hard, Mr. Davis, it's a hard question to answer, because
you've been very good at answering questions, so that's why I'm comfortable asking.
If I may digress for a second, I studied economics, and when I studied economics, my professor went on this whole tirade about the illustrious udel, which is a unit of measurement. And it's like, he can say you can like pizza, you can like steak, but you can't say exactly how many udels of pizza you would trade for a steak. Although I think it's about 2.5 slices, or I would just I would look at the posted calorie count and maybe measure it off that way. But again, this is what you're saying, and it's right, is that if the CFB takes a position that independent expenditures are treated differently in a heightened level of scrutiny or concern because of the fact that they are not subject to the rest of the audit process of CFB,
and all the regulations,
then that's a statement that should be made by the CFB by posting a penalty guideline that demonstrates the interest. So given the fact that is not there, 41 times what the candidate would pay seems high at any level. I would say maybe if you want to double it to $200, I mean, that would be fair. Again, I would say that this is you pose a very, very good policy question that.
I'm just asking what your view was. That's all.
But I'm saying it's a very good policy question that should be addressed, and as Mr. Schaefer said, maybe something that may be addressed in future rules changes, and how the CFP addresses independent expenditures. Until that day comes, I would ask that there be the fairness of abiding by the single penalty guideline that is published right now, which is for candidates.
By its face, it doesn't apply to independent expenditures, which can be up to $10,000.
But again, it's interesting when you look at the penalties as published in the rules of the CFB for candidates and for independent expenditures. That language of up to $10,000 is published in both.
The board has adopted guidelines for candidates.
Right.
It has not adopted guidelines for independent expenditures. We retain discretion up to $10,000 per penalty. And frankly, although I think guidelines are desirable, I don't think we're legally required, and we're not legally required to adopt guidelines even as to the candidates. But in any event,
Mr. Schaefer, to that point, I would address look at CAPA, the City Administrative Procedure Act, which actually does state somewhat to the contrary that it should be published and it should not be usable until it is published. And it's
but it wasn't used. I mean, that is to say, if staff adopt for internal purposes certain guidelines for their recommendations to us, but we, as we do, retain complete discretion as to the amount of the penalty. We can accept or reject the staff's recommendation, within our discretion. Then I don't think we've adopted guidelines.
And Mr. Schaefer, to that point, is something that
therefore we're not under no obligation to follow that procedure.
But I've received differing comments as to whether there are guidelines or aren't guidelines, whether the published guidelines or aren't published guidelines. But to Mr. Davis's point and to the board's point in general, to the extent that independent expenditures are given a higher level of scrutiny, I would submit to the board that it would make, for future rules of CFB, that there be a more illustrative and demonstrative statements or codification as to what is expected and what are the rules for independent expenditures, which seems different here because when you look at the rules that CFB has for candidates, they're exhaustive
I understand
to some
that.
level.
And there's no argument about the desirability of doing that, and we're going to do it. But it's an argument in this case where there were no guidelines about binding the board in any way. It's an argument to sort of equity. It's not a legal argument that we made an error of law. It's an argument in support of your other arguments about why we should exercise our discretion to be gentler to your client than the staff's recommendation.
I like the way that sounded.
That's how I interpret your argument. But I want to be clear. Our position is that we were under no legal obligation to adopt guidelines, and we retain complete discretion as we sit here today in determining what the amount of the penalty should be, up to $10,000.
And again, getting right to that point, as you just said, the totality of circumstances and to some level inequity. I think when you look specifically at what we're dealing with here, there was no mistake. There was no misleading of the public. Anyone who received the mailer knew. Anyone who was involved in that campaign could have known what was done. The fact that the reporting was done late, again, I think is far distinguishable, and we'd have a very different. I wouldn't be able to make these arguments had it been some sort of nefarious, negative mail piece, that's something that went after someone, that's someone that tried to do something uncouth and just that doesn't put a good taste in our mouths. But when you look at the totality here, the whole point of the CFB is to get civic involvement, to get the poet laureate to come and try to get people to come forward and get involved. The fact that you have civilians who are getting involved in their community in this day and era is what the CFB wants. And the fact that they made a mistake, and I'm not saying it should be zero fine, which if the board wanted to do that wouldn't be that bad either. But to the extent that a fine should be levied and that the board wants to find a fine, I would say, again, looking at the totality of who you're penalizing and why you're penalizing them, I don't think a $4,100 fine is fair and equitable. I think it's a little high.
I think we've got all of your points.
I just have another question. When was the last time the club had elections?
The club elections happen annually.
Annually.
And the board leadership has changed since then. So the executive, the officers are different. The majority of the board members are different in 2016, 2017 than they were in 2013.
But Brian Carney is a vice president in 2017.
Yes, he is. But but as I mentioned, he's someone in the last couple of years has had a couple of children. He works a lot, and his involvement in the club outside of I don't actually know what he does much now, but this is someone, again, it's a volunteer organization. We have lives. No one gets paid for being involved. I'm doing this today as pro bono. This is not someone who's at the board meetings, and I'd be happy to get you a list of if the committee wanted it, our meeting minutes, which would show that I don't think he was at a board meeting this year because, again, his family obligations and work obligations.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything further from you, Ms. Persky?
I would just like to clarify briefly, because you used the word rules several times, and I think you're using it colloquially, but to us it's sort of a term of art, that the penalty guidelines are not published, but the rules applicable to independent spenders are certainly public. They were enacted pursuant to the CAPA process, and certainly the public would know that these disclosures are required.
And if I just make one final point, Mr. Spencer, who is the treasurer of Lex Dems 2017, was not involved in the Lexington Democratic Club in 2013.
I think at this time, the board will go into deliberations. We'll be back in a little while.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to get.
So, do I have any bullet holes? So how much did you save? Huh? Are you okay?
All right, we're back in open session, and we have the following penalties and repayments to deal with. We'll start with David Greenfield. We're going to propose in a moment the following finding and penalty with respect to the 2013 campaign of David Greenfield. Violations are failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, a recommended penalty of $853, and a violation of making impermissible post-election expenditures, a finding of violation but no penalty, for a total penalty of $853. I move the approval of those findings and that penalty. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions?
I would just say, Mr. Chair, that I hope that Mr. Greenfield's lawyer didn't charge him a lot, since it went to the expense of an oath hearing when the original penalty was $990 some odd, and it was only reduced because they supplied additional documentation.
Your hope is noted. The next matter is the 2013 campaign of Manuel Lantigua. The proposed findings and penalties are as follows. Failing to demonstrate compliance with cash receipts reporting and documentation requirements, recommended penalty $216. Submitting false expenditure documentation, recommended penalty $2,250. Accepting a contribution from a corporation, recommended penalty $125. And failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, recommended penalty of $255. That amounts to total penalties of $2,846 and a recommended public funds repayment of $1,112, and therefore total penalties plus public funds of $3,958. I move the approval of those findings and penalties. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The motion carries. Finally, we have the matter of Lex Dems 2017. The alleged findings of violations and penalties are as follows: failure to report expenditures, proposed penalty $2,500. Failure to report contributions, a violation but no penalty, for total penalties of $2,500. I move the approval of those findings and that penalty. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The motion carries. That completes our business for today. I'm going to entertain a motion to go into executive session to discuss some matters, but we will not resume in public, and so I'll combine that with a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? The motion carries. Thank you all. Have a good day.